Film about the partition of India has reopened questions surrounding Britain's colonial legacy. Viceroy's House, starring Hugh Bonneville and Gillian Anderson, tells the story of Lord Mountbatten arriving in India in 1947. Here's a clip.
300 million Hindus and Sikhs want a united India. 100 million Muslims do not.
You dance with your own kind.
My own kind.
Have some respect.
New nations are rarely born in peace.
It's got to be a clean cut.
It's a bloody axe cleaving right through people's lives.
We're joined by Shashi Tharoor, author of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Shashi, a very warm welcome to you. Do you think most British people have a grasp of what partition involved?
I'm afraid they don't. My book is, of course, about the entire 200 years of colonial rule, when Britain came to one of the richest countries in the world and reduced it over 200 years of plunder into one of the poorest. Partition was merely the sort of shambolic conclusion to that entire experience, the sort of tragic original Brexit, as it were, that took place in conditions that made 15 million people lose their homes and their lives, and 1 million lose their lives. So I think Britain certainly should know a little more about the things that it was quite directly responsible for in the subcontinent.
Before we talked, I was looking at a review by Max Hastings, journalist of some repute, military historian of some repute, former editor of the Daily Telegraph and other periodicals, newspapers, who was reviewing Neil Ferguson's book, which gives a flip side, an alternative view of the colonial experience. He opens with these words. This is Max Hastings. Most modern British school children are taught that imperialism was an unalloyed evil. That was in 2003. You don't share that view?
Well, no, because I actually know people who've done A-levels in history and have never learned a line of colonial history. It is not, in fact, something that British school children are taught. Perhaps Mr. Hastings was speaking of a different era, but certainly not in recent years has history about what the British did in their far-flung colonial possessions actually been taught to British school children.
Well, you say far-flung possessions, but I mean, yes, famines killed hordes of people in India, but so too in Ireland as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, British policies on famines, which killed 35 million Indians in totally unnecessary man-made disasters because of British policy, were exactly the policies they pursued in Ireland that led to so many deaths in the Great Potato Blight and led Irish people to flee to America. Indians, of course, didn't have that option.
If not the UK, I mean, you talk about the way the British impoverished India over a period of 200 years. Was it not just one of those periods in history when part of the world enjoyed a technological advantage over others? And, nature abhors a vacuum. If the British hadn't poured into the vacuum, then the Russians would have done. That's what the Great Game, as it used to be called, was all about, how the British would block the Russians from getting into India and seizing it. And there is a view, isn't there, you may disagree with it, there is a view that says when it comes to that collection of European powers who were imperially minded, the British were the least worst option. I mean, compared, for instance, to, well, I mentioned the Russians, but oftentimes comparisons are made with the Belgians.
This is like saying you prefer being flogged with a whip to being flogged with a cane. I'm sorry, I'd much rather not have been colonised by anybody.
But you didn't have an option, Shashi, that's the point.
No,
that
the
such
point
was the
is, when you
technological
talk
imbalance
for example,
at that time that the Russians would have done it if we didn't.
Technological imbalance. Do you think the richest country in the world couldn't have bought the technology it wanted if it hadn't been subjugated by a foreign power that destroyed the industries it actually had and prevented it from creating its own industries? We missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution, true, but we missed the bus because the British Empire threw us under its wheels. It's as simple as that. We were the world's leading textile producers, the world's leading textile exporters, the world's leading shipbuilding country, the world's leading steel manufacturers. All of these industries were destroyed by the British quite deliberately. And a captive market was created by the British in India to unload their goods on this country.
When you paint that picture of what the India that might have been in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, people will look at modern-day India and say, well, in a sense, normal service has been resumed. What's the problem?
Well, the problem is where we had to start from in 1947. The British left us with 90% of the population living below the poverty line.
Did they leave anything good behind?
Beg your pardon?
Did they leave anything good behind?
Well, they left a number of things that were not intended to be for the benefit of Indians, but which, once they were left behind, were transformed by the Indians into benefiting them. such as, for example, the railways, which have been created in order to extract resources from the Indian hinterland and take them to the ports to be shipped to England for the greater glory of England. But of course, once the British left, we were able to use the railways and continue to do so for the benefit of Indians, and particularly for passenger movement, not for extracting resources. Similarly, with many other British legacies, none of which were actually introduced to India to benefit the Indians, but only to serve as instruments of either British control or British profit.
But the point about the British control that you mentioned, it had to work with those who were complicit at the other end. So who's worthy of the greatest blame? Those who collaborated or those who instigated the programme?
Well, that's a moral judgment that I'm not prepared to make right now. Obviously, those who come into your house are the ones you have to blame first, rather than, let's say, the ally who let them in through the door, through the back door very often. But the fact is that both are complicit to greater or lesser extent. Every colonial empire had its so-called native informants, its collaborators. Sadly, we saw in the Second World War, even the Nazis found collaborators in some of the democracies they conquered. This is not surprising, sadly, that's human nature. But it doesn't, however, excuse those who are attempting to portray the British as some sort of, to use Professor Ferguson's phrase, jolly good thing with a capital G and a capital T. It wasn't, not for those for whose benefit it was not intended.
I just want to share with you and our viewers a tweet from over the weekend by Liam Fox, British Secretary of State, who said the United Kingdom is one of the few countries in the EU that does not need to bury its 20th century history. Do you see no difference in the approach taken by different European powers to the colonial enterprise? Because there will be many people who feel there was a difference.
Now, I'm not an authority on the other powers, but let me respond briefly to Mr. Fox by saying that if Mr. Fox genuinely believes there's nothing to be ashamed of in British 20th century history, he might want to try the 4.3 million Bengalis who died in a totally unnecessary famine because of Mr. Churchill's deliberate decisions
do you want us,
to allow them to
do
die.
you want us to be ashamed? Is that what you want? You know,
I think there is a
Britons to
case for
feel?
atonement, and atonement will only come when there is recognition of the wrongs that were done.
But those who perpetrated are all dead. You know, a small handful of people benefited directly from the Raj. I mean, you can talk about the trickle down and the repatriation of funds to the UK, but to many people living today in the UK, don't feel like they were beneficiaries of that.
There were vast sums that were sent here, Colin, to the UK, not a trickle. Vast sums in the billions in today's money, perhaps more. Some have calculated even higher sums. But I'm not here to talk money, because I think what's far more important is the moral case. I think what really matters is for Britain to look within and to recognise there's something to be apologetic about. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, apologised last year on the centenary of an incident in which a ship laden with Indian refugees fleeing the British was turned away from Vancouver port, and pretty much everybody on board came to a grisly end, either on the high seas or subsequently at British hands. And Trudeau, even though the Canadians didn't actually kill anybody themselves, and even though that was also 100 years ago, did apologise. To my mind, I think just taking collective responsibility is a moral step that the British have simply not contemplated after 200 years of profiting from their empire. And I think it's sad. We just celebrated the centenary, or commemorated the centenary of the First World War in these last few years. It's still going on, really, till 2018. Do you know that a million Indians fought under arms for the British side? Do you know it was largely Indian soldiers that stopped the German advance at Ypres at the beginning of the war? Do you know that India supplied pack animals, food, clothing, rations, even rail lines ripped out of the ground in India and sent off to aid the war effort? And that the total contribution of Indians in cash and kind is estimated in today's money at about 80 billion pounds sterling? I'm quite sure you don't know that, because the British don't tell you that. It's a great triumph for British arms, but India has been forgotten. I drove past a statue in London to animals that participated in the war. There is no statue to the Indians who've done this for Britain. I think at some point the British really ought to look back at their 200 years, not through the rose-tinted spectacles with which you see these gauzy, romanticized television soap operas about India, but look back at the reality, not just the financial reality, the reality in terms of human lives that were affected and transformed because of the colonial enterprise, and then decide if there is something worth apologizing for. I believe there is.
Shashi Tharoor is author of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Shashi, very good to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Colin.